My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, that fear becomes all too real as we encounter the Black Wyrm of Brandonsford.
Our first segment is the basic crawl.
The Black Wyrm of Brandonsford is a 19-page module written and illustrated by Chance Dudinak. It's about a town, Brandonsford, and its many problems, chiefly a black dragon skulking about in the forest around the town, and the newly emboldened fairy folk that are reclaiming much of the nearby territory. The player characters come to town and get recruited to deal with one or more of these problems.
The module starts with a map of the forest area surrounding Brandonsford, including a number of points of interest. From there, we have an introduction where we learn about some background about the town and its troubles, adventure hooks for the player characters, and a rumor table. Next is a section called the Town of Brandonsford, where we learn about a few key locations, the NPCs that can be found in them, and a few side quests the party can get involved in. Next is a section called the Woods, which includes some random encounter tables, stats for the Black Wyrm, and a few sections detailing points of interest on the aforementioned map, including the so-called Witch of the Woods and her hut, the Fawn's Grove, a giant's house, a destroyed caravan, the Dwarves' Mine, the Dragon's Lair, and the Goblin's Castle, which is our first small dungeon featuring 6 keyed locations. Next, we have a section for a larger dungeon, the Barrow Mound, including 20 keyed locations, and the module wraps up with dungeon maps and an appendix with original magic items. Let's talk about our bona fides here, Tom.
I ran this as a one-shot, 3-hour one-shot in DCC, and in fact as effectively as a funnel for 16 zero-level characters between 4 players. Yeah. How about you?
I ran it over the course of 3 sessions using Trophy Gold. We didn't get to do everything, but we did do most of it.
Very nice.
So things we liked about the module. I'll start, Tom.
Okay.
I think the thing I like most about the Black Wyrm of Brandonsford is that it is a breeze to run. It sets a standard for just ease of use. Very well laid out. Everything is easy to find. It flows really nicely. I didn't really even have to prep very much. I just sort of grabbed it and went, and it worked great. Even improvising Trophy Gold stuff on the fly was really easy to do using the module because it's so easy to find things. Was that your experience as well?
Definitely. I mean, my first note just says, overall a good time, really smooth to GM. I found it the same as you. Everything was just kind of in the right place. And
in the right place, yeah.
And like not always in the ways you'd think. Like, for example, the write-up for the Black Wyrm, the dragon itself, is kind of a half-page thing that if you flip through, you might think that's not the right location to put it. But actually, it is. Also, as you said, like it kind of leads you to the right places as well in terms of improvisation. So there are a few places in the module. It's short, 19 pages, whatever. It doesn't comprehensively list how everything is going to react to everything else. But like when it does leave an answer up to you, for example, when I had to decide what the real deal is with some water imps that are hassling the players, are they actually going to harm them or not? I never felt like I was under pressure, like it had left me in the lurch. I just felt like I'd been led up to this point and I could just keep going from where it had left me before I moved on. Yeah, it's just really nice. You just heard the synopsis, right? This is classic. There's a dragon in the woods fantasy. And yet there's something about it that works incredibly well. I had a really good time with it overall, yeah.
Yeah, we had a really good time with it too. Something I thought was really interesting about this module is that the adventure is one that truly lends itself to just letting the players explore and getting involved in whatever they want to get involved in as they find it. I find that maybe it's just the way I run things, or maybe it's the demands of the systems that I run them in, but I find that I want more of a through line, more of like a to Z structure in the modules. I think it just fits a little bit better with the cinematic and really narrative focused gaming that I do. But in this case, just letting the players wander about and talk to whoever they want to talk to and get involved in whatever adventures they want to get involved in, it actually worked really, really well. And I think it worked well in part because the module is so easy to navigate and run on the fly. And sort of substantively, it was just really pleasurable for the players to kind of find their own adventure, to kind of find their own story and do what they wanted to do.
Yeah, because like you mentioned that you didn't get to do everything, and of course we had a one shot. We didn't either, but I think there are through lines built into it that
There
you
are.
stumble across, even when you're ignoring other things. Like my players, they never even went. They didn't go to the temple. They didn't talk to the priest guy, but there are other ways into his plot lines. Like NPCs will point you to a particular place or another person, and not just in a signposty way, like go here, then here, then here, but like, for example, there's a whole thing of how the dwarves used to be the dominant culture in this area, and there are still some dwarves living up north, or are there? But you get into that, or our group got into it because the blacksmith hadn't heard from the dwarves for a while and needed some help with that
Right.
stuff,
Yeah.
But he's also hooked into a different set of characters, which is the alchemist and the witch of the woods, as she's called.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel believable because it's more of a fairyland fantasy than that, but it feels organic, despite having this, I think, quite designed branching out into different segments of the map built into it.
I think part of the reason why it works is because even though it's not a extremely linear adventure, it's also not just a bunch of disconnected events.
Yeah.
It's not a hex crawl in the sense of like you just have no idea what you're going to find and two hexes next to each other never talk to each other or interact with each other, right? You see that a lot with these go wherever you want adventures. Like you said, there are some through lines there. The story of the dwarves, the effect of the dragon on the land, the increased presence of the fairy folk, this goblin general marshaling his forces, the ancient history of the place. There's all these like little things that are peppered throughout and can point you in different directions. Like the players can be pointed in a certain direction, but they don't have to, like you said. Yeah, it's a really, really nice balance that the author has achieved. And it feels really intentional, which I appreciated. I didn't get the impression that the author sort of stumbled into this, right? Like it all felt
exactly.
very well intentioned and structured. And so I was able to meet the author halfway and just trust it, right? I was very quickly like, okay, I trust this. I'm going to just let it do its thing and we'll kind of see where it goes. I never felt unmoored or unsupported, which is great. I thought the village plots were excellent and great fun.
Agree, totally agree.
Yeah, there are these like little like Three's Company style village plots going on in the village. There's one in particular that's quite fun. I think my group could have played all 3 sessions, never leaving the village. They were having such a good time. The thing is, there aren't 3 sessions worth of village things going on, unfortunately.
Probably,
there's not. You might get a session, maybe a half a session or 1 session out of the village, but they loved it. They were super into the vibe of the village. What did you think about those little village plots?
I really enjoyed it. There are sort of 2 that we really engaged with, to the point of the group actually explicitly saying, right, we're going to spend one night on this thing and tomorrow night on this thing, and then the day after that we're going to go for
my group did the same thing.
Yeah,
they like plan their time out. They're like, okay, we're going to do this tonight, and then tomorrow morning we're going to do this.
We had the same thing. So night 1 was on the stolen booze from the less nice tavern owner.
Yeah,
that plot is good. It's fine.
It's
we
okay.
enjoyed it.
Yeah,
it was fun to play.
Favorite, yeah.
But the best one is the blacksmith who thinks he's being tormented by fairies. And this is fun because it's like it is whimsical and lighthearted, but of course it ties into that fear of goblins and fairies thing. So as a spoiler, skip ahead a bit if you care about this stuff, I guess. He thinks he's having fairy talismans pinned to his door at nights, and every morning he wakes up, is terrified, and kind of destroys them and sets fire to them. But it turns out that it's just the village alchemist who has a crush on him but can't express her feelings. So she's pinning love letters to his door. But because he's illiterate, he thinks they're magic talismans. And there's nothing to, like, there's no dice rolling to do in this. There's almost nothing to it except that you have a character who can read, eventually get hold of a letter and read it. And yet, the reveal on this was amazing. It worked so well.
Great.
Everybody laughed, but they also loved it because it was kind of heartwarming, and it really worked well. And then they went off to hunt a dragon in the forest, and that was cool too. I'm just really impressed by the simplicity and effectiveness of it. It was really cool.
Yeah, overall, I had a great time with it. I really enjoyed the module. My group had a great time with it. Any other things you want to point out about things you liked?
Let's come back to the map a little bit. So it's not a hex crawl. It's not a point crawl either. But it basically shows you a forest with distinct locations in it. I do think it's interesting, actually, that it gives you the impression you could get lost in that forest. I think that's aesthetically important. And what I like about the locations in this adventure is some of them are known or fixed places. So there's the witch's cottage, there's the grove of the fauns where you can get some magic tree sap and stuff. But others are there to just sort of be discovered accidentally. So there's a caravan that's been raided recently and set on fire and so on. And that's a really nice mix because we talked about the through lines. You get referred to some places by NPCs because they know they're there. I know where the witch lives. This is how you get there. But things like the giant's house and the caravan, I might be wrong about this. I think you can only stumble across them. I think that idea of things happening that no one knows about and you're the first person to find out, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Another thing I don't want to dwell on details of this too much, but I mentioned how there's not much to do in resolving, for example, the fairy talismans plot. There's a few things like that in here where some scenes, quote unquote scenes, are fight the dragon, and there's details of how that might or might not work. And you're going to roll some dice, and some people are probably going to get killed. Quite a few if you're running 16 level zeros in DCC, and that's cool. But there are others where the play is deciding what you're going to do. Like, are we going to help the blacksmith? Or what are we going to give up? Because the fawns will ask you for something of sentimental value in order to get their magic item. And so it's a discussion. Oh, I've got this, or we could go get something for someone else. And then the fact that all you need to do is say, I hand them my uncle's travel diary that I brought with me.
Right.
That's it. That's the scene. And that's really great. And there's actually quite a few little scenelets in this scenario like that. And I think they really build up to making it feel like dealing with this dragon and the other scary things in the forest has kind of an emotional weight to it in a way, in that through lots of little actions, you've built up a bunch of connections quite quickly to what's going on in the background. And mechanically, it's good because I think a lot of people would be tempted to put die rolls on this or make up a mini game. OSR loves a mini game, but didn't do it. It just like had the scene and it's done and it works. It's effective. It's efficient and effective. And who can argue with that?
You know, it occurs to me that this would be a really excellent adventure for people who have never done a role-playing game before. And normally when we hear about so-called beginner modules, what beginner usually means is we're fighting rats in the basement.
Yeah.
It's a stat-based beginner notion. Whereas this, I think, is really great for beginning role players, like not even just like beginning characters, like just people who've never done a role-playing game before, because it really rewards just thinking about actions and taking actions.
Yeah.
And it sort of teaches you, in some sense, the power of this form of entertainment. You have the letter. Okay, we'll go ahead and present. What do you do? You know, okay, I'll give him the letter. Okay, now here's how this guy reacts. It kind of shows you how being in the moment and reacting and just describing what your character does leads to things. And I can't say that a lot of modules that are sort of billed as good for beginners really do this. So I think it's really interesting. I don't know if that was the intention of Chance Dudenak or not, but it's an interesting outcome.
Yeah, it is. And actually, I think one of our players on that particular evening I think it was his first RPG session, and being handed 4 characters on one sheet to deal with. Yeah, and it was good. But yeah, I've just remembered as well, the other thing I don't think we've mentioned yet, which I want to pull back in, and that's a broader aesthetic thing about this module that I think is worth praising. And that's the whole vibe and feel of it, which I think is excellently folkloric in the way of the things that happen in folk songs, like Northern European folk songs about monsters that live in rivers, or the fairy folk that live in the woods and so on. So like the fact there's no distinction between fairies and goblins in this scenario, I like.
Yeah,
that feels
I like that too.
Real life. Yeah. And the dragon, the Wyrm rather, man, it feels nicely monstrous. Like, it's not majestic. It's this horrible crocodile crawly thing that still breathes fire and will kill you and stuff. But you need special techniques to kill it. That's another thing that you get in these kind of poems and ballads that I don't think we see very much in role-playing games as well. It's totally impervious to most weapons unless you do something special.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is... I have my suspicions about the inspiration for that. We're not doing too much conjecture on the author's intentions. I think, if I had to guess one, I would say it was taking the idea of going and fighting a dragon, but removing all the role-playing game stuff and going back to early stories about hunting dragons. And I think this is what you get. And even though, it works as an entry-level adventure, even at the character power level, because in that sort of ballad, like the Lambton Worm, which I'll probably mention again in Companion Adventures, the people that go up against the dragon, including the ones that get killed by it, are fairly ordinary. Like, some of them are knights, some of them are just local farmers, and eventually one of them will defeat it. But whether that's going to be your guy or the next idiot adventurer along is another question.
Yeah, that's great. Why don't we go to questions we had? And I think it looks like I'm the only one who has a question here.
Sorry.
Which is not really a question as much as it's just a thing I want to talk about. So I will say, as much as I enjoyed the module, I found it to be a little too lighthearted for my taste, for my personal taste. Now, I will fully acknowledge this is a problem that at my table, I seem to be the only person who had this problem. Like the rest of the group seemed to be okay with the tone of the module. I'm not sure, though, if that's because they were just generally okay with the lighthearted romp vibe of the module, or if it's because I did make some little adjustments using the space that Trophy Gold mechanically gives me to increase the horror and threat level of certain encounters. And so we didn't play it like, strictly speaking, the tone that it wants you to be playing it in. So I'm not really sure. My personal feeling and my personal taste level is that this was too lighthearted. And I'm glad I didn't read it before I put it up on the calendar to run, because I probably wouldn't have done that. I probably would have said, no, this is not my thing. I'm not going to do this. Instead, I discovered after I'd agreed to run it that it was very, very lighthearted, a little bit more lighthearted than something I would normally run. And so I kind of made some little adjustments on the fly just to better meet my personal taste. But I'm curious how your group felt about it. I'm curious what you think about it, for one thing. And then also I'm curious how your group reacted to the tone of this, because it is quite winsome, I think. Even whimsical.
And,
right?
and I think I am on the kind of same wavelength as you, in that I would not have written this adventure. Although obviously I did decide to run it.
But that was mostly because I had run it and you wanted to run it for the show. That was at least partially the reason.
Little bit. Yeah, true. That's one reason I made sure it was on the calendar. But I did already have a copy, having read about it, which was, I think I was keen to do it. And that was because that was kind of, you're right, despite the whimsicalness for me, because I read the description of the dragon and I thought, okay, this is the kind of the good bit for me. But you know what, you're right. I mean, I should never listen to myself, really. The group loved it. Like, they were well into this.
The group loved it. Yeah, they loved it. Yeah, I know.
So it just goes to show what I know. And the thing is, I'd sort of become a convert by, the second half of the session. I was doing the fawns as like surfer dudes, chilling out in the woods. I would
never, ever do such a thing. And I commend you for leading into it. Yeah.
But in a way that actually helped them with that final encounter. I say final because one of the common things that happens in our group is people will return to an adventure location for more, and there is enough left over after that dragon fight that's a practical possibility. But what it meant then was that the really monstrous dragon felt particularly bad after you've met these blissed out fawns in the woods and a kind of quite nice old lady who's a witch, who I think is probably one of the most whimsical bits in it. Is that the joke? It's like everyone's afraid of her, but then you get there and she's just like
she's just
your
a nice
granny.
old lady. Yeah.
I think that's the bit, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I agree. Like I think for me, it's a little too lighthearted, but apparently it's just us, man.
I know. I know. The players at my table, they were enjoying it to the point where I almost felt personally alienated by their enjoyment. I was like, wow, they're really loving this. And I'm also having a good time, but I fundamentally found the module to not be to my taste in that way.
Rethink all my biases,
exactly.
There you go.
Yeah.
What are you going to do?
But my bias against whimsy aside, that has nothing to do with the quality of the module, which is
not at all. Yeah.
Let's go to the Chain Lightning round.
From the Woodlands encounter table, 2 idiot dragon hunters. They're planning to bait the dragon with a dead pig and then throw a net over it.
The goblin king that is tormenting the land is called Hogboon, which is just a really terrific name.
Speaking of said goblin king, he bears an emerald ring, and here's the description, or part of it. If you kill the wearer of this ring and take it as your own, you become the new goblin king. Goblins from Fairy will obey you unquestioningly. While you have the ring, you will also be hunted by the agents of power-hungry fairies who want the ring for themselves.
An entry on the stream encounter table reads, 1d6 goblins plus 1 giant beaver. The goblins are attempting to annex the beaver's lodge. They're losing, and now the beaver is very angry.
You can meet an NPC thief called Drop Dead Ned, who, and I quote, keeps a killer wasp in a tiny jar around his neck for tight situations.
Of the so-called witch Vivian, gray frizzy hair, hunched, one bulging eye, wrinkled old purple dress. Not exactly an evil witch, but just too old to care about being polite. Let's go to the expert delve. Hi listeners, Jason here. If you're enjoying this podcast, you should support it and everything we do in the Gauntlet by joining us on Patreon. We have 3 pledge tiers available for new supporters in 2024. The $2 pledge is a great way of saying thank you for everything we do, and it goes a long way toward helping us make this show. You also get some perks on our Discord, such as a special name badge showing you're on the team, and access to Patreon exclusive channels. At $7, you get early access to Gauntlet publications, as well as access to a number of exclusive releases. In recent weeks, the $7 feed has featured Cut to Christmas, a new mystery for public access, Places in the Wild, which are standalone adventure sets for Trophy Gold, Sweet Jolly Crunch Tooth, a new playbook for the Silt vs. role-playing game, Squatcher Step, a new mystery for Brindlewood Bay, and much more. And we have a ton of new releases heading to the feed in 2024, including brand new games, and scenarios and support material for existing games. Finally, at the $10 level, in addition to all the aforementioned stuff, you will receive a monthly invite to a special 2-hour coffee chat hosted by me, where you and other $10 patrons can chat about the games you're running, talk about game design, and just generally hang out with a fine group of like-minded people. So head over to patreon.com/gauntlet and pledge today. If you can't pledge to Patreon right now, there are other ways of helping us out, such as leaving a 5-star review on this podcast or on one of our drive-thru RPG pages. No matter how you help us, please know that we appreciate it and we're delighted you've decided to go on this journey with us. Take care. It's the Expert Delve, and today's topic is, oops, we accidentally did the adventure right away. Listeners, this Expert Delve is inspired by the fact that in the Black Wyrm of Brandonsford, it is very possible to encounter and kill the eponymous Black Wyrm really early. And indeed, that's what happened in my run of it. They encountered the Black Wyrm almost immediately upon setting foot in the forest, killed it, and then we had a whole bunch of sessions left to fill. So, it is the case. It's rare, I think. But it is the case that sometimes the player characters rush straight ahead to the end of an adventure, or they just stumble onto the solution or the resolution really early. And so what we're going to talk about today is, 1, is that even a bad thing?
Yeah.
And 2, what to do in the case it is an undesirable outcome and you want to adapt on the fly to that circumstance. Why don't we start with the first part, though, Tom? I know you have a lot of thoughts about, is this even bad? Maybe it's okay.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that there are ways in which it is bad, and you might want to have a response kind of in your back pocket to deal with it. But yeah, let's start with the maybe this isn't a problem answer before we get onto the main strand of things. Guys, it's 2023. We're doing a podcast about old school role-playing games. You're listening to it. We definitely have too many adventure PDFs on the same hard drive that we're reading Black Wyrm of Brandonsford off. Sometimes the scenario runs long, right? And that's its own thing. Sometimes it's over too quickly, and we'll just start another one. So that's answer number 1 is fine. We'll just do another thing. To be honest, this sounds glib, but that's pretty practical definitely for me. I think for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But then again, and this is where it doesn't work, because if you've got 3 sessions marked out as we're doing this
the
adventure.
way I plan things, right? Yeah. Where I've got one group of people for 3 sessions, and I've got to fill this time.
Yeah.
But kind of sticking with why it might be a good thing. I don't necessarily subscribe to this line of thought, mind you, but there is a whole philosophy of the OSR, I gather, where the fun of the play is just whatever happens at the table. You don't worry too much about high-minded cinematic ideals that I like to espouse or sort of narrative, structure, all that stuff. You don't worry about that. The story is whatever happens. And if what happens is we kill the Black Wyrm immediately upon setting foot into the forest, then that's just what happens. And that's the fun of it. And so it's this idea that the fun is just the emergent quality of the story. It doesn't have to be this grand narrative arc that hits a bunch of narrative beats and makes sense A to Z, and you could then translate that story into a movie or a book, right? It doesn't have to be that. It can be just whatever happens, what happens is fun, and that's great. And indeed, my players were like, did we just kill the Black Wyrm? There was a pleasure in that. You're kind of dawning on them did we just do the whole thing already?
Yeah.
Is it all done? So that's one school of thought. It's not one that I necessarily adhere to because of the type of gaming I do, but it is, it's worth pointing out, I think.
Yeah, and it's particularly appropriate to not even a sandbox campaign, but maybe if you imagine something like an XCOM style setup where you've got certain missions you're going to go and do, and you're expected to, by the end of this campaign or whatever, we're going to have dealt with problems in locations A through E.
Mm-hmm.
And like maybe this one was location B. And on the whole, the amount of time, these variances in how quickly you find the dragon in the forest are going to even out. And also, it'll just be a real triumph this one time, the one time you showed up and dealt with everything immediately.
Yeah.
As you know, I like for ages while developing my 20th century D&D with AK-47s essentially game, a lot of that stuff was about choosing targets and like trying to take over little towns and villages and running propaganda campaigns. And sometimes it was just really, really sweet to get an easy victory, even though you knew it was pure luck and pure happenstance, because it meant you could just enjoy it. And I think in a longer format than a 3-session mini campaign, I think there's your problem really, is that the fact that it's not longer in a way,
Yeah.
that still works out, yeah, pretty good. Well, but then to move slightly on to the solving the problem bit, I think there's something interesting about riding into town not as the guys who've come to kill the dragon, but as the guys that just did it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
No, I get that. Yeah. Well, okay, so let's transition here.
Yeah.
Despite all what we've just said about like how
Yeah.
it's not necessarily a bad thing, it can sometimes be a bad thing. In my case, it was a bad thing because I had to fill a lot of blocked out time with adventure.
Yeah.
And so theoretically, it could have been, there's a possibility that like killing the black worm early would have been a problem. Now, in fact, it isn't a problem. And the reason why is because this module actually really ably anticipates this possibility that you might kill the black worm really early because it can just come up in a random encounter and gives you other things to do if you should do that. We actually have a built-in solution in this module for this, and this built-in solution is actually my biggest piece of advice for how to handle this kind of situation. So in the case of Brandonsford, when you kill the dragon, the carcass dissolves into the corpse of a dwarf that was enchanted to become the dragon, which is dealt with in the history of the town. But what's great about it is it leads to further investigation. It's a new mystery. So you've killed the dragon. Okay, great. That's awesome. But now there's this new thing to do. And I think that's the key. Now, if you are writing a module, that's a different consideration than if you're just running one. If you're writing a module and you anticipate that the characters can kill the big bad right away, you may want to plan for that, right? You may want to have your dwarf corpse or whatever after you kill the big bad. You want to have some kind of mystery, some kind of follow-on thing. If you are just running a module where the author did not anticipate this so well and the characters kill the big bad or do the adventure right away, you have to adjust on the fly a bit. But when you start thinking about like, well, how can I adjust? Like, what can I do right now? Maybe be thinking about like, what is the follow-on thing? Yeah. It's a somewhat accidental outcome that the big bad or the solution or the mystery is resolved really fast. You have an hour or two left of play, or maybe you have 2 more sessions of play, and you have to figure out something on the fly. I think this is where the conversation becomes a little more interesting and a little bit more practical. Yeah. I would say the first thing is keep your cool, maybe.
Yeah, so don't panic.
Don't panic. Yeah, keep your cool. Don't act like it was an accident. Make it seem like a perfectly normal outcome. It's okay for the players to wonder if they've finished the adventure early, but you don't have to show your cards right away.
Mm.
We're big believers at Fear of a Black Dragon HQ that we want you to be a rock star GM. That's sort of what this whole podcast is about in a lot of ways. And one of the things you can do to maintain your rock star status and quality is to be cool.
Be cool at all times. Although, if I may slightly finesse that, I think it's okay if the players suss that it was an accident. That's okay too. But just don't act like it's a disaster, because it
don't
might not be
panic.
one.
Yeah,
you know.
Then I recommend you take a break. Mm-hmm. At that point in play, maybe a long break, so you have some space to figure out what to do. But you should be able to figure out what to do in about 15 minutes, right? 15 to 20 minutes, you should be able to come up with something. So ask yourself, inspired again by how Brandonsford handles the killing of the black worm, what other kinds of problems or adventures are implied by the killing of the big bad or the completion of the main quest? Brandonsford, very helpful here, right? We have this like further mystery, but also in Brandonsford, you have to go get the dragon's treasure. You can kill the dragon early in the woods, but you don't get his hoard. Like, you have to go
That's right.
find the hoard. So there's this other thing.
Yeah, and even if you do it at the Dragon's Cave, other people are looking for that treasure as well.
That's right.
And you've got to try and bring it back with you, maybe. Yeah, or set up camp there. There's loads of. In fact, the Dragon's Treasure, I guess, is the good metaphor for what's the follow up to this thing, right?
Yeah, like Tom said, are there any groups who would be upset about the big bad or the main problem being dealt with? Or is there a treasure out there in the world that now multiple parties are trying to claim? How do these other characters react? Is there someone else who might now view the player characters as a major threat because of what they did? Maybe they take some kind of retaliatory action. Think about some of these possibilities and come up with something in your 15 to 20 minute break that you're taking to react, to kind of fill out the session, to make it, if you want to end on a higher note than, oh, we killed the bad guy in the first 10 minutes of the session. Like, what do we do now, right? It's very possible if you're really good. I think I could do it if I had to put my mind to it. You can maybe come up with a further mystery on the fly. You can flesh out something that the module didn't even anticipate.
Oh, yeah.
You can make your own dwarf corpse show up. But I think the key is you don't have to come up with much.
No, you just got to make it to the end of the session, basically, with a few
to
tantalizing
the
things,
session,
right?
Right. Yeah, you just need a little punchy thing to follow up with to kind of say, oh, that wasn't the real adventure is here. And now here's this group shows up, or Hogboon comes riding down the hill, or whatever, right? And then that's the true finale of the adventure. It's not hard. You don't have to do much to fill out a session. That's
I think Rival Adventurers. This is another one where
it's a good
the
one.
Black Wyrm excels as an example because it has the idiot dragon hunters, which is fun, but it also has some competent rivals available as well, and those show up pretty early in the scenario, I think. And ideally, this might be part of your scenario prep, is throw in at least the hint of other people around, so that when they show up after the unfortunate early death of the poor defenseless dragon, it doesn't seem like it's just a cheap reaction, because it won't be, because you planned ahead for this. Like have them sort of seated around. But Jason, I think you're right. Like a 15-minute break, that sounds long. It's actually not. People will talk amongst themselves for that long about stuff they can't just did.
And it's plenty of time for you to figure out another encounter or two.
Exactly.
To flesh things out with. I think the key is when you're thinking of that encounter, just think about what we've talked about here is like, what are the mysteries or problems or possibilities implied by the killing or the defeating of the big bad or the resolution of the adventure, right? Like, what's sort of implied by all of that? What's in the background that you've already established? What can you bring forward and make into the true finale, the true bad guy, the true adventure? What can you do to do that? And your players will be very excited by that, because they're going to be like, oh, did we do it? Oh, what's going on? But no, there's more. They're going to love that, right? And they're not going to have any idea that they accidentally did the adventure right away, So.
No, exactly. I mean, it's totally okay, by the way, to say something like, oh, I didn't expect this to happen exactly. And because I think it's not the adversarial set, but there's something quite satisfying about, oh, we accidentally, or sort of, we did better than expected. And that feels good. And so, you can be I think the whole group is, you and the players should be in a pretty good mood at this point and keep that feeling rolling,
Yeah.
The real danger is if you panic, or if you get really defensive about how everything's gone off the tracks all of a sudden and it's not planning out how you thought this was going to go. That's the worst.
If the characters rush right up to the end of the adventure somehow, or they run into
don't block it. Yeah.
Don't block it. Yeah. Just let it happen. Or don't make it unusually difficult or cheat the players, right? Let them have their win. It's kind of on you to figure out what to do after that, I feel like.
Yeah.
I feel like the wrong thing to do is to arbitrarily make it impossible for them to do the thing.
That's long-standing, famously bad GMing, isn't it? Like, the GM didn't think of this thing, and therefore I wasn't allowed to, like my character who speaks French wasn't allowed to read the French message because that was the secret code or something. That's not cool. That's the least cool thing possible to do,
absolutely.
Basically.
Yeah, I don't think that's not a good way of doing it at all. Unless you're playing, for some reason you're playing a game where that's a thing at a system level, like all my games, for example. You are literally not allowed to defeat the bad guy until you do a certain mechanical thing. But the players know that, right? It's not something you're springing on them, right? They know they have to get a certain number of clues, answer a question before they can unlock the opportunity to defeat the monster, right?
Exactly. That's diegetic.
That's different. That's
locks.
different.
Yeah. That's cool.
This is pretty quick little expert delve. Before we end, I want to throw out one little thing for the module writers out there, which is I think it can actually be really fun if you write your module this way.
Yeah,
If
yeah.
you write it to where the title of the module and indeed the setup of the adventure, the introduction of the adventure, implies a certain sort of final encounter, and then the characters, because it's written this way, they do the final encounter really early and then discover there's something further. That I think is really fun. There's not many modules that do that, but I love it when they do. Like, I love it when it's like, oh, that wasn't the real adventure. This is the real adventure. I find that very exciting. And so you can actually kind of lean into this idea.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the Black Worm of Brandonsford is a good, probably, even though it's not set out that way deliberately, it is a good model for how you
It
would
accounts for
account
it.
for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
It accounts for the
nice.
possibility. Yeah, it definitely does.
Yeah, yeah.
You could do a lot worse than taking a look at the Black Worm of Brandonsford and seeing how things connect in a way to account for this possibility, right? This possibility of you find thing X before maybe you thought you were going to, or you defeat the
Yeah.
monster really early or whatever. It's structurally, it's a really, really fascinating bit of module design. But that's a slightly separate topic, but a good one.
Yeah.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and go over to the next segment? Okay, it's Companion Adventures. I just have two things, two books.
Okay.
It looks like you have some film and music and other things. Why don't we start with your film?
Actually, no, wait, let's go back and start with the folk story, which is The Lambton Worm, because this leads into the film. So The Lambton Worm, I want to recommend people go and read,
I've never
it's
heard
a
of
folk
this.
story.
Yeah.
So there's not really a definitive version of it, but it's from the north of England. So I want to say County Durham, maybe.
Okay.
And it's this idea, a guy goes out fishing and he catches a weird-looking eel thing, and it gradually turns into a big monster that ravages the land while he's gone away. And yeah, like people come up and try and kill it, and they can't.
Oh.
The guy who caught it eventually comes back and he has to get advice from a wise woman on what he should do to defeat this big worm, which includes making armor with spearheads all over it, I think. So, which kind of recalls the Black Worm adventure stuff
Oh,
where you
yeah,
had to
yeah.
get people to tell you the specific ingredients. And that leads me to my film recommendation, dubious film recommendation, which is Lair of the White Worm from 1988, starring Hugh Grant and a future Doctor Who. I'm not really sure if it's actually relevant, but it sort of is based on the Lambton Worm a bit, and also not. I think it's a Bram Stoker novel adaptation, one of his less successful ones.
I believe that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Basically, what other opportunity am I ever going to have to include Lair of the White Worm in Companion Adventures? So try it out. It's got the most Freudian felt tip pen in a dream sequence you'll ever see on film. So that's one to look forward to. But tell us about your books, please, Jason.
Yeah, my book recommendations, if I'm being honest, they're not really super direct connections to the content of the module. When you have a module like the Black Worm of Brandonsford, this was a really difficult one to pick companion adventures for.
Because it's classic fantasy
it's
D&D.
classic
Yeah,
fantasy
it's so
D&D.
classic you can't do it.
Yeah. It's so, like, everything in a lot of ways is a good companion adventure in some sense, any kind of fantasy thing. So instead, I'm just going to pick up on the idea of light-hearted fantasy and make my recommendations thusly. So this year, I have been reading all of the Stephen King fantasy books, like the Dark Tower series and things like that. Last year, I kind of did all of his classic horror books, and this year I've been doing the fantasy ones. And so I'm going to recommend first The Talisman, which is by Stephen King and Peter Straub from 1984. I think it's considered a modern day classic. I'm pretty sure it is. It is really fantastic. Young boy or young man going on a fantasy adventure, except because it's Stephen King, it also like kind of blends in a lot of the real world. It's very much a precursor to what the Dark Tower would become, this sort of fantasy story that kind of weaves in and out of modern day settings back into the sort of fantasy setting. And eventually, via the sequel to The Talisman, The Black House, which I've also read this year, it actually directly connects to the Dark Tower as well, in addition to being a sort of thematic connection between them. But it's a great story. I like it a lot. It's just a fun adventure. I'm also going to recommend a more recent book by Stephen King, 2022's Fairy Tale. Very much in the same spirit as The Talisman, also very loosely connected to his Dark Tower universe. It's a boy and his dog. I don't think there's a dog, but it's that kind of same vibe sort of story. Kids on bikes kind of fantasy story. And they're just good reads. Stephen King he's such a big, massively successful commercial writer that I don't think he gets enough credit for what a good writer he is. He's a really, really excellent writer. And The Talisman and Fairy Tale are great examples of it.
Nice. I will conclude then with a couple of music recommendations. One is a band called The Gloaming. They're like an Irish-American outfit featuring is it Irlo Leonard, people like that, and they sort of established their own genre in a way, which is based on a lot of Celtic folk music vocabulary, you could say. And I think it's a good mood companion to the Black Wyrm of Brandonsford. In order to recommend a specific work, I'm just going to say their album, The Gloaming 2 from 2016, but Gloamings 1 and 3 are also available, so knock yourself out. And the other thing I want to mention is a song. So again, this is like a folk story thing, which is called Long Lankin, and it's for the musicologists among us. This is Child Ballad number 93. And this, for me, I think is great for evoking this sense of, or rather, one particular recording, the one by Martin Carthy from the 60s, great for this sense of the fear of the creatures outside the window at night, which is a recurring theme of the light-hearted village in the Black Worm. But it's not even about a fairy. Like, it's just about this guy who is a stonemason, and he doesn't get paid for his work by the Lord of the Manor. So when the Lord of the Manor goes away, he sneaks in with the aid of a duplicitous nursemaid, and it gets, to be honest, content warnings for violence and so on, everyone. But it's just so creepy, the atmosphere of this particular recording, and the song in general is pretty messed up in any version. But yeah, the Martin Carthy one in particular is worth checking out if you want to go more the Jason and Tom creepy, nasty fantasy vibe with this kind of scenario, rather than the lighthearted stuff. But yeah, that's all I got. Like you said, it's really hard to choose.
This is a hard one.
This one, you know.
This was definitely the hardest one to pick companion adventures
and
for,
and that's no criticism of the scenario. It was just tough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, listeners, that's our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Gauntlet RPG. I think we have a Blue Sky account as well, which I think is also at Gauntlet RPG if you're testing those waters. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. And of course, we would love your support on Patreon. It's patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thank you so much.
Jason, thank you. Thanks, of course, also to our iconic editor, Rich Rogers. And thank you, listeners, as ever, also for listening. Goodbye.
Take care.